200 corpses. Yes, you heard right. This was the number of bodies the guards found in the Croc cell. But how was he able to accomplish this? How did he take the lives of so many men? Stay until the end of the video and find out. The day began like any other at the cecot terrorist confinement center. The guards moved through the cold, gray corridors, their footsteps echoing on the concrete as they made their morning rounds. The routine was relentless, designed to maintain absolute control over the most dangerous prisoners in El Salvador. But that day, something wasn't right. A strange, nauseating smell permeated the air, a stench that seemed to emanate from a specific section of the prison. A smell so intense that it made some guards cover their noses with the sleeves of their uniforms. At first, they thought it might be a problem with the sewage pipes. Cecot was a fortress built to contain the worst of the worst, but even the most secure prisons can have maintenance issues. However, as they approached the source of the stench, they realized that the smell was different, more pungent, thicker. It was the unmistakable smell of death, of decomposing bodies. And the strangest thing was that the source of the stench seemed to be in Croc's cell. Croc had been Cecot's most troublesome prisoner since his arrival. Known as one of the most violent leaders of the MS-13, his name was synonymous with terror on the streets of El Salvador. No one approached his cell without reason, and the guards only visited him to throw his daily meal through a small opening in the steel door. But that day, the smell was unbearable, and with it came uncomfortable questions. What was happening inside that cell? When the guards gathered in front of the steel door, they looked at each other in uncertainty. No one wanted to be the first to open it, but the hierarchy dictated that the highest-ranking officer give the order. With a firm gesture, he signaled two of his men to remove the bolts. The door slowly opened with a metallic screech that echoed down the hallway. Darkness filled the cell, and the stench hit the guards like a wave of putrefaction. Several of them stepped back, choked with nausea. They turned on their flashlights, shining their beams into the cell. At first, they could see nothing but shadows, but as their eyes adjusted, what they discovered made their hearts stop. The Croc stood in the center of the cell, motionless, his head tilted to one side, his face expressionless, his eyes staring into space. He seemed calm, almost indifferent, but his hands and clothes were stained with dried blood. The floor of the cell was invisible. It was covered with bodies, piled on top of each other. Bodies partially buried in shallow graves dug into the concrete. Arms and legs were twisted at impossible angles, faces disfigured by decomposition, and mouths open in expressions of terror and eternal pain. Some corpses still had their eyes open, their opaque pupils staring into space. It was a scene straight out of hell itself. The Croc stood there as the guards watched in shock. He didn't try to attack or escape. He simply stood there, surrounded by the carnage he had created. One of the guards, overcome with horror, vomited in the hallway, his knees shaking. Another instinctively backed away, his face pale and his eyes bulging. No one could believe what they were seeing. In all, there were more than 200 bodies. The cell had become a mass grave, a clandestine cemetery hidden in plain sight. But the question was how? How had the Croc managed to kill so many prisoners without anyone noticing? How had it created graves in the concrete? How had it hidden the stench for so long? As the guards recovered from the initial shock, they began to piece together clues. They realized that the bodies were not ordinary prisoners. They were all gang members, members of rival factions who had sworn loyalty to other MS-13 leaders or to the opposing gang, Barrio 18. The disappearances had been reported for weeks, but it was assumed they had been transferred to other high-security units or placed in solitary confinement. No one suspected they had been executed and buried in the Croc cell. Investigations revealed the magnitude of the conspiracy. The Croc acted alone. He had managed to recruit a select group of loyal prisoners, men who had once been his subordinates on the streets and who now obeyed his orders without question, even in prison. Using a network of coded messages and bribes to corrupt guards, he had coordinated the murders one by one. Calling rival prisoners were lured into his cell under the pretext of negotiations or false truces. Once inside, they were executed with precision, their bodies dismembered to facilitate burial in the makeshift graves. The tools used were primitive but effective. Fragments of sharpened metal, chunks of broken concrete used as makeshift shovels, and even human bones fashioned into knives were discovered. The Crook had proven himself a sadistic and meticulous strategist, using his cell as both an execution chamber and a mass grave. His ability to manipulate the guards and conceal his crimes was chilling. No one had noticed anything out of the ordinary until the stench became impossible to ignore. But how did the Crook manage to do all this? The Crook was immediately taken to the interrogation room. They handcuffed him with reinforced shackles, tying his wrists and ankles to a steel chair bolted to the floor. In the room, the light was cold and white, designed to disorient the prisoners and expose every detail of their expressions. 3 armed guards remained in the room, their eyes fixed on him, ready to intervene if he tried anything. But the crocodile showed no sign of resistance. His face was expressionless, his gaze fixed on the wall, as if he felt nothing. The commander in charge of cecot entered the room accompanied by an intelligence agent carrying a thick file containing photos of the bodies found. He placed the file on the table in front of the crocodile in a chair on the other side, his eyes filled with suppressed fury. Without preamble, he opened the file and let the images speak for themselves. Photos of decomposed corpses, dismembered limbs, faces frozen in expressions of pain and fear. The Croco stared at the photos without blinking, his eyes empty, his expression unchanging. He didn't seem affected in the least. "What do you have to say about this?" the commander asked him sharply. The Croco just tilted his head slightly to one side, as if studying the images with curiosity. The calmness on his face infuriated the commander, who slammed his closed fist on the table, causing the photos to jump. "Answer me, you bastard. How did you do this? How did you manage to murder more than 200 men in your cell without anyone noticing?" The Croco looked at him. His cold, calculating eyes met those of the commander. There was no fear in his eyes, nor regret, only a disturbing serenity, as if I had accepted his fate. He shrugged and spoke in a soft, almost whispering voice. "They came to me. They were only—" The commander felt a chill run down his spine. The indifference in the Croc's voice was disturbing, almost inhuman. How could he speak of a massacre so calmly? Rage began to rise in his throat, but he controlled it. He needed answers, no outbursts of anger. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the Croc. "Explain yourself." The Croc smiled slightly, a smile devoid of mirth or emotion. He settled back in the saddle, his chains rattling as he moved. "It was easy. Most came of their own free will. I made them believe there was a truce, that they could negotiate with me, that they could curry favor with me. I promised them protection, power, and they believed me. They were so weak, so desperate. They surrendered to me without hesitation." The commander gritted his teeth. The cruelty with which the Croc described his actions was chilling, but he needed more details. "And the bodies? How did you hide them? How did you dig those graves in the concrete?" The Croc smiled again, an expression that made his face look even more sinister. "I didn't do it. I only have loyal ones. I've always had them, even here. Some guards, some prisoners. Loyalty isn't something you can buy with money. It's bought with fear. They dug, they buried the bodies, and then I killed them too. I couldn't leave any witnesses, could I?" The commander felt the room go cold. The Croc had manipulated not only the prisoners, but also his own men. He had used fear and deception to turn his cell into a clandestine cemetery. And the most disturbing thing was how he told it, without remorse, as if it had been the most natural thing in the world. "How did you manage to prevent the smell from seeping in before then?" the intelligence agent asked, her voice trembling slightly. The Croc responded with chilling coldness. "I learned a few tricks on the streets. It's amazing what you can do with quicklime. It slows decomposition. The smell is more expensive, but eventually time wins, as in everything." The commander remained silent, processing the information. Everything had been calculated, planned down to the smallest detail. The Croc had transformed his cell into a death trap, luring his enemies in and eliminating them one by one without leaving any clues. What disturbed the commander most wasn't the ingenuity behind the murders, but the complete lack of empathy in the Croc. For him, death was a tool, a means to consolidate his power, even in prison. Why did you do it? For revenge? For power? The commander asked, hoping to find some glimmer of humanity. The Croc stared at him, its eyes empty, its voice low and icy. Because it had the power. Here or out, I'm always the king. Silence fell in the interrogation room. The guards stared at each other, their faces pale and their bodies dense. No one had expected such a direct confession, so full of pure evil. The commander felt a knot in his stomach. For the first time in his career, he felt fear, not for his life, but for what was in front of him. He wasn't just a murderer. He wasn't just a gang member. He was a monster, someone who had accepted evil as part of his essence, without regret or remorse. You're not a king. You're nothing, just a rotten prisoner. The commander snapped, trying to regain control. The Croc let out a dry laugh, a dry, mocking sound. That's what you think, but look around you. You're surrounded by corpses, by men I killed while you slept peacefully. I control fear. I decide who lives and who dies in this prison, in this hell. I'm God. The commander felt a chill run down his spine. He stood up abruptly from his chair, pointing at the guards. Lock him up in solitary confinement, so he never sees the light of day again. The guards rushed to untie the chair's chains, roughly lifting the Croc, but he offered no resistance. He allowed himself to be dragged, his eyes shining with unwavering madness, a mocking smile on his lips. As they led him down the hallway, his voice echoed off the concrete walls, cold and merciless. You can lock me up all you want, but fear is already here, and I always come back. But what did Bukele think of all this? The guards left the interrogation room with the echo of the Croc's laughter still ringing in their ears. A cold, hollow laugh, as if he had won despite being chained. They didn't say a single word as they walked through the dark halls of the cecot, but their faces were tense, their bodies rigid, as if carrying an invisible weight. What they had heard in that room was more than a confession. It was a declaration of power, a demonstration that the crocodile, behind bars, remained an untamable monster. The order was clear. They informed Jeep Bukele immediately. The magnitude of the massacre in the Croc cell could not be hidden. It wasn't just a security issue. It was a direct challenge to state power. More than 200 corpses, men buried like garbage beneath the feet of their executioner, executed without anyone in the cecot even noticing. All while Bukele publicly proclaimed the invulnerability of his most secure prison. This wasn't just a mass murder. It was a humiliation. The convoy left the cecot at full speed. The armored vehicles moved along the road as the sky began to darken. No one spoke. The guards knew they were carrying a time bomb to the presidential offices, and no one wanted to be near it when it exploded. The second commander, sitting in the front seat, mentally reviewed how he would explain the inexplicable. He had seen many things in his career, but never anything like this. How do you tell the president that the man the country fears most had turned a maximum security cell into a clandestine cemetery? Upon arriving at the National Palace, the atmosphere was tense. Bukele had been notified that it was urgent and was waiting for them in his private office, an austere, dark room with wooden walls and a polished marble table. Security at the palace was impenetrable, with armed guards on every corner. But the real danger lay inside, behind those doors. Bukele's fury was well known, and what they were about to reveal would not only destroy his image of invulnerability, but also his promise to control the gangs. The commander and his men were escorted to the office without delay. The door opened, and there he was, standing by a window with his hands in his pockets and his gaze fixed on the San Salvador skyline. He didn't turn when he heard the door, didn't greet him, but remained motionless like a statue, his silhouette dark against the light from the window. The tension was palpable. Bukele knew the news wouldn't be good. Talk, he ordered without turning around. His voice was low but charged with authority. The commander swallowed, took a step forward, and began to speak, trying to maintain his composure as he described the scene in the Croc cell. He explained how the bodies were found, stacked, dismembered, and buried in makeshift graves. In the concrete. He spoke of the stench that alerted the guards of the magnitude of the carnage. With each word, the air in the room seemed to grow thicker. Bukele didn't move, not even when the commander described the Croc's cold, empty stare, its remorseless confession. When the commander finished, the room fell completely silent. Only the faint hum of the air conditioning and the guards' ragged breaths could be heard. Bukele said nothing for several seconds that seemed eternal. Finally, he turned. Slowly, his eyes filled with a suppressed fury that chilled the blood of those present. "How many bodies?" he asked, in a cutting voice. "More than 200, Mr. President, all rival gang members, members of MS-13 and Barrio 18. Bukele pressed his lips together, his jaw tense, and took a step forward, his eyes fixed on the commander with an intensity that made him step back slightly. "How did this happen in my prison?" His voice was low, dangerous. "How could that damn animal turn a maximum security cell into a cemetery and you didn't notice?" The commander gulped, feeling the cold sweat on his back. "The Croc manipulated his enemies, sir, lured them into his cell under the false promise of alliances. He had accomplices, loyal guards, and prisoners who helped him dig the graves and hide the bodies, and then he killed them too." Bukele's gaze darkened. His fists clenched until his knuckles turned white. The hatred in his eyes was palpable. "So, not only did he murder 200 men, he also corrupted my system, my prison. He humiliated me." The commander felt a knot in his stomach. There was no softening the blow. The Croc had defied the state and won. "Yes, Mr. President. He planned everything meticulously. He made us look like idiots." Silence filled the room again. Bukele walked slowly to his desk, leaned on the edge, and crossed his arms, his gaze fixed on the floor. No one dared to move. The tension was unbearable, as if the air itself was about to explode. Suddenly, Bukele looked up, his eyes blazing with fierce determination. "I cannot allow this to remain like this. Not after what I've promised this country. Not after he defied me like this." He turned to the commander. His voice as cold as steel. "I want every guard and prisoner involved found and executed without trial, without questions. This wasn't just a massacre. It was a blow to my power, and I want whoever is responsible to pay. I want the Croc to be held accountable until his last breath." The commander felt a chill. He knew what that meant. The Croc wouldn't just be isolated. He would be tortured, destroyed slowly and methodically. He would become a living example of Bukele's power. "Yes, Mr. President, it will be done." Bukele nodded, his face a mask of cold resolve. "I want security tripled at cecot. Not a single shadow left unguarded. If a prisoner disappears, you and everyone who works there will pay the price. Understand?" "Yes, sir. And I want that damn cemetery cleaned up. No one must know what happened there. No one. Did you hear me?" The commander nodded quickly. He knew this was an order to erase history, to hide the humiliation. It was a proxy war, and Bukele couldn't afford to lose. "As you command, President." Bukele approached the commander, his face only inches from his eyes filled with a relentless hatred. "And you, if you fail me again, you'll wish you died in that cell next to those bodies. Understand?" "Yes, Mr. President." Bukele abruptly turned his back on them. "Get out of my sight and do your damn job." And now that he was looking for the Croc, the convoy of armored vehicles left the National Palace and headed at full speed toward the cecot. Inside the vehicles, the guards were silent, their faces hardened by rage and shame. They had been deceived, manipulated by a man who, even in prison, had managed to evade their vigilance and murder more than 200 gang members without anyone noticing. The humiliation was unbearable, and the thirst for revenge burned in their chests. They knew that what they were about to do wasn't just following an order. It was a matter of honor, to regain their lost control and respect. When they arrived at the cecot, the atmosphere was cold and tense. The prison was completely silent, as if the building itself knew what was about to happen. The guards didn't stop to speak to anyone. They knew exactly where to go. They headed to the isolation cell where the Croc had been locked after his gruesome confession. A reinforced steel cell with no windows or natural light, designed to break the will of even the strongest men. But the Croc was an ordinary man. They'd seen him laugh in the interrogation room. They'd heard him speak of and their crimes without the slightest remorse. They knew it wouldn't be easy to break him, but they were determined to try. The steel door rang with a metallic echo when it was opened. The cell was dark, the air cold and damp. In the center, chained hand and foot, was the Croc, sitting against the wall, his head bent forward, matted hair covering his face. He didn't move when the door opened. He didn't even look up. He seemed to be asleep, or maybe he just didn't care. The guards exchanged glances of suppressed hatred. There was no fear in him, not even after being exposed as the person responsible for the massacre. He remained defiant, as if beyond the reach of pain or hopelessness. The second commander stepped forward, his face hardened with rage. Without saying a word, he pointed at his men, and they pounced on the Croc, a pack of hungry wolves. The first blow was straight to his stomach, a punch so strong it made his body buck forward, expelling the air from his lungs. Before he could catch his breath, another guard hit him across the face with the butt of his rifle, a sharp impact that made his head bounce off the concrete wall. Blood gushed from his nose, but he didn't scream, didn't make a sound, just raised his head slowly, his cold, empty eyes staring at his executioners with an expression of absolute contempt. This only enraged the guards further. The blows intensified. Punches and kicks rained down on his body like a storm of hatred. They kicked him in the ribs, hearing the crunch of bones breaking. His screams were muffled by the blood filling his throat. They dragged him across the concrete floor, his face scraping against the rough ground, leaving a trail of blood and skin. One of the guards stepped on his back, pressing his face into the ground, while another hit his legs with an __, tearing his muscles and leaving black and purple marks. He began to cough, spitting blood. His breathing labored and painful, but he didn't ask for mercy, didn't beg for his life, he just smiled. A crooked, bloody smile that sent a chill down the guards' spines. Even while being brutally beaten, he continued to show contempt, as if the pain meant nothing to him, as if he had already accepted his fate and was simply mocking his tormentors. "Keep smiling, you bastard," one of the guards snarled. His face twisted with rage. He raised his __, and slammed it into the Croc's face, splitting its lower lip and sending one of its teeth flying through the air, hitting the wall with a thud. The Croc spat out blood, staining the floor dark red. He looked up slowly, his eyes swollen and purple, his smile still there, bloody and defiant. "They hit like little girls," he muttered, his voice choked with blood. The guards lost control, lifted him off the ground, and shoved him against the wall, their bodies surrounding him like a pack of beasts. The blows rained down on him relentlessly, breaking his body, crushing his bones, tearing his flesh. Blood splattered the walls, staining their uniforms, but they didn't stop. They hit until his arms grew tired, until his knuckles bled from the friction of the contact. And still, he croaked. His eyes remained full of defiance. His smile never disappeared. When they finally dropped him to the ground, his body didn't move. He was unconscious, his face unrecognizable, swollen and covered in blood, but he was still barely breathing, a ragged sound that sounded more like the moan of a wounded animal. The guards looked at each other, their chests heaving with exertion. They knew this wasn't over. They knew they had to follow Bukele's order to break him completely. Without any delicacy, they lifted his inert body and dragged him through the halls of the cecot. The echo of his body hitting the ground resonated off the walls, a cold, metallic sound that washed the blood away from the other prisoners, who cowered in fear. Their cells, terrified. No one wanted to suffer the same fate as the Croc. No one wanted to face Bukele's fury. They arrived at a special isolation room, a torture chamber designed to destroy bodies and spirits. They placed the Croc in the center of the room and chained his arms, lifting him until his feet barely touched the floor. His body hung like a limp, inert corpse, his wrists bleeding from the friction of the metal handcuffs. The room was cold, dark, and the echo of his breathing was the only sound in the air. Then they waited for him to wake up, to regain consciousness and feel the pain of his shattered body. They wanted him to open his eyes and realize that there was no Captoria, who was condemned to suffer until his last breath. They wanted to see the fear in his eyes, wanted to hear his pleas, but when he finally awoke, his gaze was still, empty, and his broken lips curved in a weak smile. "That's all you have," he murmured, his broken, trembling voice. The guards felt a mixture of horror and rage. Even in that state, he was yielding. There was no fear in him, only hatred and defiance. And as they watched him hanging in the chains, they knew they weren't facing a man but a demon that wouldn't break so easily.